This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
Hey there, sports history fan. Arnie Chapman here from the Sports History Network. Now, before you jump into this episode, I wanted to share with you an exciting giveaway we have going on with Home Field Apparel. We have a digital $50 gift card to homefieldapparel.com for one lucky fan of the Sports History Network. All you got to do is head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways to sign up. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Arch Ward is a name that most sports fans have never heard of. Yet, sports fans love what he contributed to the games we love to watch, particularly baseball and football. Who was Arch Ward and what made him such a giant in the world of sports? We'll answer that question next on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 147, Arch Ward. So, who was Arch Ward and what makes him such an important figure in the history of sports? Especially when it comes to Major League Baseball and the National Football League? Well, Ward was the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune for most of his professional career, beginning in 1930. While there, Ward was the person who came up with the idea for the Major League Baseball All-Star Game in 1933. A year later, Ward created one of the most fascinating football events ever staged, the Chicago Charities College All-Star Game, a series that pitted a team of college all-stars against the defending NFL champion. It was a game that lasted 42 years from 1934 until 1976. Ward also created the All-America Football Conference, which existed from 1946 through 1949, and three of the teams from that league still play today: the Cleveland Browns, San Francisco 49ers, and the Indianapolis Colts. And as if that wasn't enough, Ward is also the person who came up with the idea for boxing's Golden Gloves. Not only was he a terrific sports writer and editor, he was a phenomenal sports promoter and marketer, and I'm going to take a look back at his magnificent career and all he did with my guest, Gary Webster. Gary's previously been on Sports Forgotten Heroes to discuss the All-America Football Conference and the NHL's Cleveland Barons. Okay, before we jump into today's show, a couple of notes. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook, and please give Sports Forgotten Heroes a like right here and hit that subscribe button as well. As always, thanks for your support. And hey, if you want to reach out, please hit me up at sportsfh.info sportsfh.info@gmail.com. That's sportsfh.info@gmail.com. All right, let's get into today's show about Arch Ward with my guest, Gary Webster. Gary, welcome back to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could be here.
Oh, Warren, thank you very much for having me back. I've enjoyed all the podcasts we've done.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. The podcast continues to grow. I'm thrilled you're back here. And we have, I think, a really interesting topic. Arch Ward. He is a name that I'm quite sure is not familiar to many sports fans, but what he did, what he started, what he created is something that sports fans are quite familiar with, and that would be the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. He started the All-America Football Conference, of which you and I did a podcast about, and 3 of those teams from the AAFC currently play in the NFL. And he also started the Golden Gloves boxing tournament. So who was Arch Ward, and what makes him such an important figure in sports history, particularly when it comes to Major League Baseball and professional football?
Well, Arch Ward was a sports journalist, and he served as editor of one of the country's major newspapers, that being the Chicago Tribune, which undoubtedly gave him the clout to be able to do such things as creating baseball's All-Star Game that came about in 1933. I mean, I've been a baseball fan since I was 8 years old, which goes back to 1964. So I don't know Major League Baseball without an all-star break. It is such a part of the game now. It is, you look at the schedule, when in July is the all-star break going to be? I can't imagine baseball without an all-star break.
Mm-hmm.
That was Arch Ward's idea. And then a year later, which I know is the project that you are working on currently, Ward came up with the idea for the college all-star football game. And I remember the college all-star football game, even though it was last played in 1976. It's kind of hard to believe it was last played 48 years ago, because I can remember when that was how the professional football season started, before the exhibition games got underway. If Roger Goodell will forgive me for calling them exhibition games, which is what they are. Before the exhibition season started, the NFL champion would play a hastily assembled group of college seniors. Well, they had been college seniors. They were now about to begin their professional careers. And it was a method of raising money for various charities, and the game was played at Chicago's Soldier Field, and it was a fixture of professional football until 1976, at which time the professionals had come to dominate the game so much it was no longer competitive.
Yeah,
and it was dropped after the 1976 season, and I'm sure part of the reason for that, I mean, you would never get away with something like that today. Now you have the big controversy over college players whose teams make it to bowl games, maybe big major bowl games, and players opting out. I don't want to get hurt in this game that doesn't mean anything. I've got a big professional future in front of me, so I'm not playing. And that's why you could never have something like the college all-star football game today. And then came the All-America Football Conference, Arch creating his own league in 1945. The league started play in 1946. And as you mentioned, when it merged with the NFL, three teams, the Cleveland Browns, my team since I was 8 years old, the San Francisco 49ers, the Browns and the 49ers were the gold standard of the All-America Conference. And then the Baltimore Colts were also absorbed into the NFL for 1950. And the Browns are still in business, interrupted in the late 90s, but back in business. And the 49ers have been operating continuously since 1946. So this is Ward's legacy. Two of the three things that he created were the Golden Gloves. I admit I don't know much about boxing. I'm assuming the Golden Glove still exists.
Yes.
In which case it would be 3 out of the 4 things that Ward created are still with us today.
Yeah, he absolutely an amazing individual. And it all started because of the World's Fair. They needed a big event around the World's Fair in Chicago, and he just came up with this idea for a baseball all-star game to be played at Comiskey Park. And as the World's Fair bled into a second year, they said, well, we need another idea. And he conceived of the Chicago Charities College All-Star Game. He got buy-in from George Halas of the Chicago Bears and somehow convinced all of these recent graduates of college who were, they had left college and were either pursuing a career in professional football or wanted one last hurrah. He got them to all come to Chicago and play the Chicago Bears. Just an amazing thing. But here's a question for you, Gary. Arch Ward attended Notre Dame, and upon graduation, he became the school's publicity director under Knute Rockne. How do you think that helped set Arch up for a career in journalism, particularly sports journalism?
Well, I was mentioning how the San Francisco 49ers and the Browns, the gold standard of the All-America Football Conference. Notre Dame was the gold standard of college football. At that time, it was certainly the most famous college playing football. Rockne, the most famous college football coach, and yet they still felt it was necessary for somebody to spread the gospel of Fighting Irish football. So they needed a publicity director, and Ward turned out to be that guy. The experience that he received in doing that, I mean, largely newspaper reporting is publicity.
Mm-hmm.
Broadcasting, which I've been doing for 38 years, is publicity. So you needed somebody who knew how to write. Ward knew how to do that. You needed somebody who knew how to bang the drum for whatever institution he was seeking publicity for. And Notre Dame already had fame from coast to coast, but really it wasn't until like the middle 20s that Notre Dame achieved the legendary status that it would eventually achieve. And having Ward to create publicity for them certainly helped in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, after he finished at Notre Dame, after his role as publicity director came to an end, he went to a small newspaper in Rockford, Illinois for a couple of years, then joined the Chicago Tribune as a sports reporter, and then worked his way up to sports editor in 1930. What can you tell us, if you could tell us anything, about his career as sports editor of the Chicago Tribune and how that position helped him open doors for his other endeavors, such as the Baseball All-Star Game and the All-America Football Conference.
Well, Warren, knowing what I do about the newspaper business, newspapers, of course, were so much more influential and powerful in that era when essentially communication was newspapers. Radio was in its infancy. Television didn't exist. Of course, there was no such thing as the internet. So people got their information from newspapers. To be working in a market the size of Chicago, at that time the second biggest city in the United States, what really impresses me is the fact that someone as young as Ward needed only 5 years on the staff of the Tribune to work his way up to sports editor. And I mean, think of all of the sports that were going on in Chicago at that time. That would have been a fantastic place to get your feet wet in the newspaper business, because you had 2 Major League Baseball teams, you had 2 professional football teams, keeping in mind that the NFL was in its infancy at that time. But you had 2 Major League baseball teams, you had 2 NFL teams, you had, on a much lesser scale, you had hockey, and of course the Blackhawks being among the original 6 in the National Hockey League. You would have professional basketball, you would have horse racing, you would have college football. In those days, the University of Chicago was a big deal in college football, and you also had Northwestern being in the Big Ten. The University of Chicago was in the Big Ten for a time. So you were able to, I should say, Ward was able to cover so many different sports and to do it well enough to, within 5 years, become promoted to sports editor. Chicago was almost as big time as it got, second only to New York.
Yeah, I mean, he was only 34 when he got the job as sports editor. And by the way, for those wondering, the second NFL team at that time was the Chicago Cardinals, now known as the Arizona Cardinals. What do you think? It's a funny question. Where do these ideas spring from? I mean, hey, let's get an all-star team together. Let's get all the best Major League Baseball players to come to Chicago, to Comiskey Park for a mid-season game. Let's have the best players in baseball play against each other. How do you conceive of such an idea?
Well, the venues were there. Wrigley Field, home of the Cubs, and Comiskey Park, home of the White Sox. So you had a place to play the game. And at this point, National and American League players did not compete against each other. Other than at this point, spring training was not what it is today. Having research like the 1920 baseball season for my book about the world champion Indians, I was surprised to find out they played 8 exhibition games. That was all. 8 exhibition games. It's not like today when you have 25 to 30 games, or what began in the 30s and continued into the 1940s, the practice of barnstorming. Teams would wrap up their practice in the South, wherever it was that they might happen to hold spring training, and then they would barnstorm Up north, the one that comes to mind, obviously, being a Cleveland baseball fan for a number of years, the Indians and the New York Giants would barnstorm their way north and literally play 15 to 20 games against each other every spring.
Wow.
But you didn't have that in the late 20s and early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there was no such thing as interleague play.
Right.
So the only time National Mid-American was in the World Series. And I think it was probably a natural thing for someone as immersed in sports as Ward was to contemplate what would it be like to get the best players in the National League and the best players in the American League on the same field for an exhibition game. You could imagine how would Babe Ruth do against Dazzy Vance or Bernie Grimes? You didn't know because they didn't play each other. And granted, it's only an exhibition game, but I mean, they were playing to win. They were bearing down, and you could see what would Ruth do against the best in the National League. What would Bill Terry do against the best pitchers in the American League? There was a chance to find out, and I don't know if Ward really thought that it would become the major event that it, knowing the kind of guy that Ward was, I'm sure that he was not surprised that it turned out to be a great success, a sellout crowd, even in the depths of the Depression. They still sold out Comiskey Park for this event. Ward was a big thinker, and I don't think he was at all surprised when something that was in the minds of most people is a one-shot deal. They're going to do this to hype up the Chicago World's Fair, and everybody will get a kick out of it, and then that'll be the end of that. I'm willing to bet that Ward may not have said so at the time, but he probably expected the All-Star Game to take off and become what it is now. He was just the kind of innovative thinker who would have expected such an outcome.
That was my next question for you. Did people think it would be as successful as it has become?
Well, it was advertised, as we've discussed, as a one-shot deal. But, I mean, first of all, it was almost a storybook finish, the way the first All-Star Game turned out. I mean, the National League was able to lure the greatest National League manager in history, probably to this day, still the greatest National League manager in history, Tom McGraw, out of retirement to manage the National League. And the American League was managed by Connie Mack, who had been managing the Philadelphia Athletics for, well, at that point, it would have been 32 years, and was going to manage for another 18 years. And I'm sure you know the answer to this question. Who hit the game-winning home run for the American League?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I'll give you three guesses, and the first two don't count.
Don't.
Who else would it have been?
Don't tell me it was the Babe.
It was.
Oh, my gosh.
Babe Ruth hit a two-run homer that turned out to be the game-winning hit. And at that point in his career, Ruth was almost washed up. This was 1933, and he retired in 1935. But on the big stage, the Bambino always found a way to come up big, and this was the biggest stage other than the World Series. The first time that the best from the American League met the best of the National League, and the Babe hit the game-winning two-run homer.
Wow, really, really good stuff. Hey, on the heels of the baseball All-Star Game, he created the college All-Star Game, the Chicago Charities College All-Star Game, which was the football game. But let's jump ahead. Let's move past that for the time being. What about the AAFC? What was his thought process behind creating the rival league to the National Football League?
Well, I found out what that was when I was researching my book about the AAFC, but I didn't find out until I reached the end of the line after the merger of the AAFC and the NFL, because somebody asked Ward, "Are you happy now with the way things have turned out?" And he explained what his reasoning had been for creating the AAFC in the first place, and I'll get to that in a moment. But I think it's fascinating to look at the era when the AAFC was created. The National Football League had a monopoly on professional football. It had been challenged on 3 different occasions in 1926 by a league calling itself the American Football League, which lasted for 1 year. Then in 1936 and 37, the second American Football League came along. It went belly up after 2 years, but there is one team still in professional football that was created in the second American Football League, and that would be the Los Angeles Rams, who were created as the Cleveland Rams in 1936 in the AFL and were granted admission to the NFL in 1937 and sort of became the Vagabond Rams as they left Cleveland for Los Angeles and then left Los Angeles for St. Louis and then left St. Louis to go back to Los Angeles.
Right.
But they were the one remnant of the second American Football League, which still exists today. Then there was a third league called the American Football League, which existed in 1940 and 41, and which suspended operations due to World War II after the 1941 season, and just never resumed those operations. So the NFL had a monopoly in 1944. There were 3 different potential challengers to the NFL in the 1944 and then 45 era. One league was, well, let me see here. Let me make sure I get my facts straight. There was a league that was called the Trans-America Football League. It never played a game. It never even signed a player, but it made noises about challenging the NFL after the war. Now, I would imagine Ward was probably among the people who were anticipating a great boom in professional sports, professional football in particular. After the war, the Depression was over. People had money to spend. They were going to be looking to have fun, and sports was going to be an outlet for a lot of people. And so entrepreneurs were beginning to think nobody was going to challenge baseball because there were 16 teams, there were 2 leagues. But the NFL, with a monopoly on professional football, might be ripe for some competition. So the Trans-America Football League was organized but never went anywhere. And then there was another league here in what was this one called? I have my source material here, and I'm patting myself on the back because I'm reading my own book. What I'm using for my source material, the second league was called the United States Football League, and like the Trans-America Football League, it never went anywhere other than to hire Red Grange as the league president. But they threw in the towel within a couple of months. That left Ward and the All-America Football Conference. I think that Ward anticipated the sports boom that I mentioned. He felt there was a place. I was going to say a need, but really I don't think it was a need. But there was a place for a second football league. And according to Ward himself, when the AAFC merged with the NFL, and he was asked, are you happy with the outcome? This league that you founded 4 years ago now ceases to exist. Yes, 3 of the teams have been absorbed by the NFL, but your grand vision seems to have failed. Ward's grand vision, the reason that the All-America Football Conference, and it is the All-America Conference.
Right.
A lot of people still call it the All-American Conference, and that was not the name of the league. It was the All-America Conference.
Right.
And the reason Ward called it the All-America Conference was he wanted a league that would encompass the entire country, because at that time, the National Football League was truly not national. It was in the northeastern corner of the United States. The furthest south franchise was Washington. The furthest west was Green Bay. And literally 3/4 of the United States didn't have professional football. Ward wanted to change that. And he was able to do so by putting 2 teams on the West Coast, the 49ers and the Los Angeles Dons, and putting a team in the deep south, the Miami Seahawks, which are in and of themselves a fascinating story.
One day I'm going to do some research on that team. I promised myself on that. And by the way, there's no such thing as a Seahawk, mythical creature.
Well, the folks in Seattle might be interested to know that.
It's mythical.
I'm interested to know that.
Yeah.
Seahawk is a fictitious bird,
Yes,
in other
yes,
words.
yes. No such thing. But go on.
So that was Ward's idea, to expand professional football from coast to coast. Now, the AAFC also had 2 teams in New York, which I hardly think was necessary. And, of course, they put a team in Chicago.
Right.
Ward was a Chicagoan, and the league was to be headquartered in Chicago. And his grand vision was that the Chicago franchise would be the gold standard of the AAFC.
And it was far from it.
Far from it, yes. But that was Ward's plan, although he had a second idea, which he revealed, and my research did not uncover this in the early stages of the AAFC, in the creative stages. But once the AAFC ceased to exist and merged with the NFL, Ward, in answer to the question, are you happy that the league is... I mean, it was the first league to actually really give the NFL any competition, other than the American Football League of 1960 to 69. The AAFC was the only league to hang on more than 2 years against the NFL. The AAFC existed for 4 years. And Ward's response to how he felt about the league merging with the NFL was that it had served its purpose, in his opinion, because it had raised the standard of living of the average football player. Ward said that in the middle 1940s, average players made maybe $1,000, $2,000 a year at most. Thanks to the AAFC and the bidding wars that ensued, the bidding wars for talent, the average football player was making, I think roughly like twice that $2,000 amount. And Ward said, that was my goal. That was what I sought to do, because I felt these players have a very short career, not much opportunity to make money, and they weren't making what they were worth. He didn't suggest that they did in 1950 make what they were worth, but they were making more than they had before the AAFC existed. And he claimed that had been his real intent with creating the AAFC, to raise the standard of living of professional football players. And that had been accomplished. Things did go back to normal after the AAFC was gone and there was no more bidding for players until the AFL came along and the salaries began to skyrocket again.
Right. Well, what I find interesting is he goes through all of that by creating a second league, the AAFC. But a couple of years prior to that, the NFL actually approached him to become the commissioner of the NFL, but he turned that down. Why would he have done that? Was there a thought process perhaps that, well, I want to do all of this for the NFL players, but if I become commissioner of the NFL, I might not be able to do that, so I have to go out on my own to try and help the players?
Well, at that point, and I don't have the answer to this question, we don't know what kind of power, what kind of authority the commissioner of the NFL had. And Ward was quoted as calling the NFL a minor league outfit. The question then becomes, did he feel that he would not, as the commissioner of the NFL, have the power or the authority to make the changes that he felt would be necessary to make the NFL a major league, if he truly felt that it was not a major league? Like in that era, we know that the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, had virtually unlimited power to run baseball as he saw fit, given to him by the owners when they begged him in 1920 to become commissioner to overcome the stench of the Black Sox scandal. They basically told Landis, write your own ticket. You can do anything you want, but we got to clean up the game, and we can't trust ourselves to do it. And those owners then, maybe 10 or so years later, said, okay, never again are we going to give a commissioner the kind of power that we have given to Landis. So we don't know what kind of power the commissioner of the NFL had. And Ward, being a creative individual, being a big thinker, you would think that he might have jumped at that opportunity to take over the NFL and say, I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming if necessary into the major leagues. I don't believe you have that status at this time. But, okay, we know he was offered the job. What we don't know is, was there like an interview process? Was it really a sincere offer? Did the owners tell Ward, here's what we're going to allow you to do as commissioner of the NFL? And he said, well, no, that's not good enough. I would need more authority than that, or I need more money to work with than that, or we don't know the parameters of the offer. But you would think he would have jumped at an opportunity like that, because he seems like the kind of guy who would have believed that he could have turned the NFL into the kind of operation that he felt it should and could be.
Right. Well, going back before the AAFC, he definitely had his hands on the pulse of football. He created that other fantastic event, the Chicago Charities College All-Star Game. How do you think he viewed the game's role in bridging college and professional football? And did he see it perhaps in any way as a stepping stone for college players?
Well, I think he would have, and again, after he had talked about improving the financial situation for professional players, here would have been a chance for these guys, the college players, to show what they could do against the best that the NFL had to offer. Because, again, it's important to remember this was not like the NFL All-Stars against the college All-Stars. This was the college All-Stars against the NFL champions.
Yeah.
Therefore, this is the best the NFL has to offer. And if these collegians take the field and prove themselves worthy, it should certainly help them in contract negotiations. And I think it was a chance for the NFL to do the same thing, because college football was much more popular than the NFL.
Yes, exactly.
At that time, not only was it more popular, it was much more highly thought of. It was much more respected than the NFL. I think Ward was undoubtedly not alone in his opinion of the NFL in the early 1940s, or 1934, when he created the college all-star game. For me, I believe that the NFL modern era dates back to 1933. And the reason that I use that year is because that was when the NFL split into Eastern and Western divisions, and the winners of those divisions would play a championship game. So for my money, and I think for a lot of professional football historians, 1933 is really the beginning of the NFL's modern era, or we might want to call it the NFL as we know it today. And I think he was not alone in believing the NFL was minor league. I think people may very well have felt that the brand of football played in college was superior to the brand of football played in the NFL. So if it was a chance for the collegians to prove their worth against the NFL champions, it was also the NFL's chance to show how they stacked up against the collegians. So I think both sides had an opportunity to benefit from that game.
Absolutely. More so for the professionals, because like you said, people just had such a higher regard for the college game at that time, and just the professional game just wasn't catching on in the way some people had hoped it would at that point. And part of it was because of the kinds of cities that the NFL was in. It wasn't in all of the big major markets at that time. How did Ward convince college players to come to Chicago to play in that game? What was the benefit? Because some of these players already knew they were heading to a professional football training camp of some sort somewhere. And some were like, yeah, you know what? I have no desire to play professional football, but sure, I'll this will be my swan song. How did he convince these college graduates to assemble in Chicago to take on teams like the Chicago Bears, the Green Bay Packers, so forth and so on?
I would think that, again, they played the game at Soldier Field, which seated more than 100,000 people. And I would think that would be a significant inducement. If, as you just said, for some players, it's going to be their swan song, okay, in front of 100,000 people, go out there and give them something to remember you by. And that would certainly provide such an opportunity. Otherwise, we're talking about competitive people. And here is a chance for you as a collegian to show what you can do against the best of the best, even if the public may not have seen it that way. Here's a chance for you to find out as an individual, how do you stack up against the guys who are getting paid to do this for a living? I would think just here's a big stage. 100,000 people are going to come to this game and watch you strut your stuff. And I would think, knowing what motivates athletes, that would have been kind of a hard invitation to turn down. Although, mentioning what you did about the athletes who decided not to play professional football, and that gets back to what we discussed about Ward minutes ago, the financial inducements weren't all that great. I believe it was 1936 when the NFL instituted its college draft.
Mm-hmm.
And the very first player drafted, a guy named Jay Berwanger, first number one draft pick in the history of the NFL, said, no, I'm not playing professional football. And he didn't.
Yeah, the money wasn't there. But the other reason, well, look, he got Hallis to buy in, and that was important because Hallis had to go to the other owners and say, listen, there's this opportunity. I think it could be really good for us because we'll go up against the college all-stars, show them that we have a superior game. And by the way, the first game was a 0-0 tie. Neither team scored. But we'll end the second game, I think, was 5-0. These were not spectacular games from that standpoint to start off with. But there was another underlying reason. There was goodwill involved. Like you talked about in 33, this was at the height of the Depression, and that's when the baseball all-star game took place. You have the World's Fair. What else can we do? Well, let's put together this football game. Oh, and let's raise money for charity. So anybody attached with this, there was goodwill involved too.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I don't know a whole lot about the charities that were involved, but yeah, you could even use a little guilt if necessary. Like, hey, we're playing this game to raise money for these really worthy causes. Do you want to be an old stick in the mud and say, no, I don't want to help out? Do you want to do that?
Yeah.
I'm sure many of them would want to be the big All-America football player who said, I don't want nothing to do with this charity game. Count me out.
Yeah. Gary, one of the things that always bothers me is when an organization, a league, whatever it is, comes out and says, this is going to be the first annual. There's no such thing as the first annual. Nothing has happened. It could be a second annual, but you can't have the first annual.
No, because there's no guarantee. There's going to be a second one.
Exactly. So I don't know why I just said that, but it just hit me. But where I was going, again, just like the baseball all-star game, did people really think that this thing had legs and would be as successful as it was? I mean, you're taking college all-stars, college-age players, putting them up against guys who do this for a living, and are they really going to contend? Are they going to compete? Did people think that this was that good of an idea and it would be as successful as it was and last as long as it did?
I think when you have to remember the era that we're talking about, so there was always some risk involved because 1933, the height of the Depression, 1934. The Depression is still in full swing, and people don't have the discretionary income to be able to spend on basically, frivolous events like an all-star baseball game, like an all-star football game. So there was risk involved just because of the era that we're talking about. Although, again, with the college all-star game, you had the hook of this money is going to charity. As far as I know, not a penny paid for a ticket to the baseball all-star game has ever gone to charity. I don't think so. So you have that hook with the college all-star game. But I don't think it's possible really to overemphasize when you're talking about, did people think this could be competitive? Could the collegians really stand up against the professionals? And if I'm not mistaken, and you can probably correct me on this, I believe that the entire history of the college all-star game, I think the all-stars only won something like 9 times.
Yeah, they won 9 games. So they played 42 games. So in reality, give or take a game or two, there were 2 ties. And there were some close games, but there were some blowouts, big-time blowouts. They won basically a quarter of the games. It's not the worst thing. They won almost 25% of the games.
And you have to take into consideration how quickly this team must have been thrown together. You're playing the NFL champions. Now, granted, they're just beginning their practices and their exhibition season, but you are playing a game that last year played 10 games, 11 games, won the championship. They probably brought back pretty much the same roster as the previous season. Yep. So they were accustomed to playing together. The All-Stars got thrown together in a hurry, and football is probably the ultimate team sport. You have 11 guys out there, and they need to work together for a significant amount of time in order to become a strong enough unit to be competitive, especially against the NFL champions. There may have been involved here just a novelty factor, just the idea of seeing all these stars together, stars who played on the West Coast and the Midwest and the East Coast, and famous names that I'm going to pay for a ticket and I'm going to get to see Crazy Legs Hirsch and whoever it may be. There had to be, I think, some novelty factor in that even if the games weren't terribly competitive, and I don't know how competitive the ticket buying public expected the games to be, but there was the novelty factor of seeing these guys that you have heard about for the last 3 years. I mean, in those days, well, I'm not sure if freshmen could play in those days or not, but you heard about these guys for the last 3 years, and if it's somebody who played for UCLA and you live in Chicago and there's no television in those days, I'm going to get to see this guy play in person. So even if the game is not terribly competitive, I get to see the biggest stars in college football on the same field. And that, in and of itself, could have been worth the price of admission.
Yeah, I think for the most part, the fans came to see the college players. Like you said, they had heard about them. Maybe they saw a picture of them in a newspaper, saw them on the newsreel before the movie started, when they went to the movies. But that was it. This was their opportunity until the 50s rolled around when television started to broadcast football games. Arch Ward, he created the baseball all-star game. He created the college football all-star game. He created the All-America Football Conference. He created the Golden Gloves. What about as a writer? his day job. What kind of writer do you know? What kind of writer was Arch Ward?
Well, to be the sports editor of a paper like the Chicago Tribune, he must have been a very good writer. And I would think that just based on my knowledge, which has pretty much been obtained over the last, almost 15 years now. It's kind of hard for me to believe that I started writing books like 15 years ago, and that's when I became exposed to the newspapers of that era. And from my experience, at least with Cleveland's papers, the sports editor was essentially a columnist. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Ward at any time was a beat writer for any of the Chicago teams, or the sports editor obviously is the guy in charge of the entire sports section and decides how much do we devote to this sport, how much do we devote to that sport, how much opportunity do I give this writer and that writer, how much leadership and guidance did he provide for the people on his staff. But just based on what I've learned about the Cleveland papers of that era, the sports editor spent most of his time being a columnist and expressing opinions. Mm-hmm. And I would guess that was probably Ward's main function at the Tribune. First of all, again, doling out the column inches and how much coverage each sport is going to get, and then weighing in on the issues of the day. What's up with the White Sox? What's up with the Cubs? With the Cardinals? With the Bears? With the Blackhawks? My experience has been that the editor is essentially a columnist expressing opinions, and Ward would certainly seem like the kind of guy who was pretty opinionated and probably not afraid to express it. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Well, he was. He also authored a couple of books. He wrote a book about Frank Leahy. He wrote a book about the Packers. He wrote a book about the White Sox, and he had his column. And he was certainly the standard at the time for sports editors. Not having known him, only knowing about the things that he did. What do you think his legacy is? I mean, the one thing that the baseball all-star game in the early 60s handed out an MVP award, and it was called the Arch Ward Memorial Award. And then later, it became the Ted Williams Award. So it's sort of a shame that the guy who founded the Major League Baseball All-Star Game and who had a trophy, an award named after him, it was taken away. It was his idea. How can you criticize a Ted Williams Award? But what do you think the legacy of Arch Ward is or should be?
Well, I'll get to that, but I wanted to bring up one thing and get your opinion on this, because it's something that kind of fascinates me. Mm-hmm. Having written the book about the All-America Football Conference, and Ward put that together, I was much too young to understand what was happening when the American Football League of the 1960s was born. Mm-hmm. But I read about it, and I do know essentially how it came together, that the football boom had started with the famous overtime championship game of 58 between the Colts and the Giants. And so there was a demand for football, which really didn't exist when Ward created the All-America Conference. And we know that the AFL, the men who started the AFL, called themselves the Foolish Club. They were just a bunch of guys who had money, wanted football teams, couldn't get into the NFL, and said, okay, let's start our own league.
Right.
Ward was really the fulcrum of the All-America Conference. He created the league. There's no question about that. But what interests me is, and I'd like to, because you have studied Ward's career, get your take on this. To the best of my knowledge, once Ward had created the All-America Conference and got the owners in place, I mean, we talked about him being offered the job of commissioner of the National Football League. He was not even commissioner of the All-America Football Conference. You would think that he might have appointed himself to that job, but to the best of my knowledge, based on the research I did for the AAFC book, I did not see his name mentioned. And granted, I certainly didn't see every bit of information that was written about the AAFC during its 4 years of existence. But after the league was created, I did not see Ward's name mentioned again until after the merger, when he was asked the question that we have referred to earlier on, being asked, what do you think now that the league is merged with the NFL? Are you happy with the way things have worked out? How could you want to create a football league so much that you would go to the time and the trouble and the effort to do so, to find the owners and find the cities? And then, as best I can determine, he totally stepped away from it. He totally washed his hands of it. It was.
I don't think he totally washed his hands of it. I think he still really enjoyed his work at the newspaper. He did fight for the AAFC to replace the NFL as with their champion to take on the college all-stars, because it was a 1-year contract. And so he said, well, you know what? I'm going to have the AAFC champion play. And this was after the AAFC had been in business, and the NFL fought that. So I think he still had his hands very heavily involved in administrative roles of some sort in the AAFC. But no, he was not the commissioner of the league. And, you know, the shame of it all, it was, you know, the AAFC and the NFL merged in 1950, and it wasn't long after that Ward unfortunately passed away in 1955. He died of a heart attack. So I don't know what else he might have had planned going on. I mean, he was not an old guy. He was only 58 when he passed away. So I think he still had a role in the administrative duties of the AAFC, but his first love, I believe, was being a writer and being the sports editor of the Chicago Tribune.
Well, I find that very interesting, because he probably was involved in administrative things that really didn't get publicity, which is why I didn't read anything about them.
Yeah.
To answer the question about the legacy, first of all, you need to know about the AAFC and how it changed professional football. Mm-hmm. As we've talked about, there are still 2 franchises left that were born in the AAFC, the 49ers and the Browns. The AAFC did, I think, force the National Football League to modernize to an extent. It did help the financial situation for the players. And as for the baseball all-star game, as I said earlier, I can't conceive of a baseball season without an all-star break. It has been there every year that I've been a fan, which goes back 60 years. It has become such an institution, even though, I mean, there have been questions in recent years about the importance of the all-star game. And granted, it's not the same as it used to be.
It's not
the game's fault itself, but interleague play has just
I totally agree with you. I think interleague play affected the All-Star game in a very, very negative way. And by the way, it was the first of its kind, right? If there was no baseball All-Star game, would hockey have an All-Star game? Would basketball have an All-Star game? Would there be a Pro Bowl? Yeah, maybe. What do they say?
Somebody else have come up with that idea.
Exactly.
We don't know.
Yeah. So, well, listen, hey, Gary, thank you so much for spending so much time with me to talk about Arch Ward, who truly was a huge figure in the history of sports.
Absolutely. And I hope that through these podcasts that we have done, we can bring that name to the attention of people who have never heard of him and don't know the amazing things that he accomplished, the things that exist today that we may very well not have had Ward not been the innovator that he was.
Exactly. Again, Gary, thanks so much. And it's always a pleasure having you on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Well, Warren, it's always my pleasure chatting with you. I hope we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
Arch was certainly a visionary. One can only wonder what else he had in mind before his untimely passing in 1955 at such a young age. He was only 58. But what he did create certainly left a terrific legacy. Thanks again to my guest, Gary Webster, and thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.